Hello Year 12 and welcome to the first video of Lesson 1 this week on the Holism and reductionism debate. And video 1 is all about what is the debate and what is holism. Okay, so what is this debate? So when we see how a machine works, we can look into two different ways. We can look into either the individual parts, or we can look into how the system works as a whole, which then becomes much more than a sum of its parts. And the holism and reductionism debate is concerned with what level at which it's appropriate to explain human behaviour using these two levels of explanation. Reductionist explanations try to break thought and actions down into the smallest and simplest parts, like if we were explaining a car, down into the cogs and into the gears and into the individual shifts of motion that happen in the engine. Whilst holistic explanations try to consider the person as a whole, an indivisible system that can't be broken down into those constituent parts. So let's look at holism to start with. So holism is this argument or theory that proposes that it only makes sense to study people or humans or behaviour or any sort of thing that's to do with humans as an indivisible system, rather than something that can be broken down into its constituent parts. And this is because behaviour and experience can only be understood when analysing a person's behaviour as a whole. So how different components are interacting with each other and how that impacts the overall behaviour rather than just looking at tiny little bits of it. Therefore, the focus is always on the whole system or the whole person rather than the little bits that make up that person. The assumption is always that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, a term coined by Aristotle, but it's a concept that's adopted by Gestalt psychologists, whose bread and butter is holism. Gestalt means whole, it means the whole is greater. In German, it's their bread and butter, this holism. Okay, so a great example of holism in psychology is humanistic psychology. And Carl Rogers was a big proponent of this. And Carl Rogers believed that trying to understand behaviour in terms of laws or conditioning or biological processes or anything like that was actually disrespectful of our unique differences as human beings. And instead, humanistic psychologists believe that successful therapy actually means bringing together all different aspects of the whole person. It means bringing together their biology, their psychology, their cognitive aspects, everything about the person, bringing it together and treating all of it. They also believe that the individual reacts as an organised whole rather than a set of stimulus response links. And what matters most is a person's unified identity. And therefore, this lack of identity, this lack of unified identity, or a sense of wholeness in the person, often leads to a mental disorder. Okay, so it's now your turn. For task 1, I'd like you to look at the video using the link on your worksheet, and this is really looking at how holism can be applied to a different concept. We've looked at how it can be applied to humanistic psychology. Now I'd like you to look at how it can be applied to insight learning. So I'd like you to first when you're watching the video, explain what's happening so you understand what insight learning is, and then explain why this behaviour can't be explained through conditioning, either simple classical conditioning or reinforcement operant conditioning, and therefore then explain how it can be used as an example of holism. Okay, complete the example on your worksheet. There's a space and a box on your worksheet to complete it in, and then move on to video 2, and I will see you there.